I'm just as guilty as anyone or as a lot of people of, going on Twitter, seeing someone say something and replying and saying something snarky and being like, send, ha, I own them, versus when I'm having a political discussion with a friend who disagrees with me, there's a totally different mindset because I know this person. I know this person at their heart is just like me, trying to get by, trying to live their life. They're not like, they don't believe something out of malicious intent. You know what I mean? No one does, or I'd like to believe that almost no one does.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking to someone about your political beliefs in that sense, where it's like a conversation face to face and you know that person, it's completely different.
The 2020 presidential election was one like I've never seen in my lifetime. I know that there are many, many different opinions about the process, about the election itself, about the two men who represented our two parties. And so I wanted to ask somebody from Gen Z, from the newest voter generation, their take on the whole political process, the landscape, and how faith affects any of it, if it does. And so I had a great conversation with Jacob Muff. He is 20 years old. He is a filmmaker in college, and I think you will be just really, really interested in his take on the whole process. Real with Reed, it's a safe, honest, constructive place to have conversations about faith from different perspectives. And episode 11 starts right now.
Well, hi, Jacob, and thanks again for joining me today.
Hi, Reed. Thank you for having me. This is going to be cool.
Yeah. So Real with Reed, it's a safe, constructive place to have conversations from different points of view. And I wanted to broach the topic with you today of politics, which on the heels of an election, which was unlike any that I remember in my lifetime, which is a lot longer than your lifetime.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear your perspective, but give us just a snapshot of background of who you are and the sort of where you're coming from, how old you are. I know you're in college, so give us a little snapshot of who Jacob is.
Sure. Yeah. So I am Jacob Muff. I am turning 20 in like 3 days. I go to college at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I've grown up in Nebraska most of my life, been a Husker fan, as you can probably tell from my room in the background, most of my life. I'm going to Lincoln for a major in emerging media arts with a focus in filmmaking. I want to make movies as my career. That's my passion. So politically, I was raised conservative, Republican, Christian, pretty standard for most of my life. That was kind of what I went along with. It was what I knew. I had a few friends, when I was a kid, a friend would say like, are your parents Republican or Democrat? And I'd be like, I think they're Republican. Like, oh, my parents are Democrat. Be like, okay. Didn't really know what that meant. When I was a kid, one kid told me, well, the Democrats want to help poor people and the Republicans don't want abortions. And I was like, I guess that's an explanation. So when I was a kid, didn't really know much. I just knew that my parents voted for Bush, and Romney. That was pretty much all I knew. And so when I was about a junior in high school, this was around the time of the 2016 election, I was old enough to know about what was going on and actually have friends that had opinions, and things like that. Because when you're a kid and things like the Obama elections happened, it's like, okay, there's these two people running for president. This is a thing that happens. You don't really care. You don't really know,
Yeah.
But when I was in high school, that election happened and there was a lot of like more intense debate going on in high school than I thought there would be about a presidential election. Obviously this election that just happened was extremely controversial and there was a lot of heated discussion, just people yelling at each other and riots and all these things happening. But back in 2016, it was pretty heated as well. And so I remember just because my family was Republican and was going to vote for Trump, just kind of siding with that automatically. And then with having a lot of friends though, that were like, no, Hillary may not be a great choice, but that's the right choice. I'm like, okay. So after that election happens, I also during that time heard about the third party candidates and just kind of like, oh, that's weird that there's like other people that are going to run for president and they know they're not going to win, but they're going to do it anyway. That's strange, and I heard about the Libertarian Party and Gary Johnson, probably the most out of the third party candidates.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend that I didn't know very well and still don't know very well, but that was pretty passionate. Like that was like, yeah, Gary Johnson, you should vote for him. He's like a better third option. I'm like, okay, that's weird. I wasn't old enough to vote. So
you shouldn't have voted for anybody. Just
no, yeah, exactly. I did. Yeah, I was uninformed. I was a teenager. Like, I mean, I technically still am, but and then after that, I listened to this podcast kind of randomly. There were these two YouTubers that started this political podcast. I was like, that's weird. Why would they start a political podcast? Sounds interesting. And the podcast was called Who Would Build the Roads? And I was like, that's so strange. What is this about? And they were libertarian. They were proposing the idea. They were the title was a joke off of the idea of like, well, without the government, who would build the roads? And so they were proposing this idea of like, what if we didn't need very much government in our lives? What if like that's unnecessary and people can just kind of live their life and not hurt each other and go about their day? And I was like, that's so strange and interesting and cool. I have never heard about this. And so from there, I sort of became really interested in this idea of like, whoa, there's this like idea of our system that we have right now isn't right. And we should make some changes. And so that sort of prompted me to look at the ideas that I was raised with in a political sense and sort of re-examine them. So I went from like, okay, the standard kind of Republican thing usually is like economic freedom is good. However, we should keep as little as people possible kind of coming into America as we can. Or like, things like, American freedom is good, but also we need to have troops everywhere to hold the world accountable. We need to be involved in the Middle East, because without us, what are they going to do? What's going to happen? And I started re-examining, or like pro-life is good. Like, we need to protect babies, but also the death penalty is also good. It's like, ooh, isn't that a little inconsistent? Stuff like that. Yeah. So I started sort of re-examining from there.
Wow. Well, you gave me so many different follow-up questions in my mind. I'm going to try to keep all of them. But you said near the beginning of your introduction that Republican, conservative, Christian, and the whole thing. And the question that popped into my head is, are those good, meaningful titles anymore?
That's interesting, because I'm still definitely a Christian. I didn't have anything change regarding my faith when I kind of had this political shift. I sort of just started seeing inconsistencies that I thought like the Republican general sort of platform had with Christianity and what God wants. But I think those being meaningful adjectives, to describe someone, I think maybe they were more, it's tough because when I was at least a kid, I can sort of see this, there's sort of this stereotype that comes to my mind of the like, I feel like a lot of Christians, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, I understand it, are kind of single issue voters about abortion, which is understandable. And they see the Republican Party as kind of like, well, they're pro-life and they want to repeal Roe v. Wade, so I'm going to vote for them. And I understand that. And I think that's still a thing now. I think that there are plenty of people that voted for Trump this year simply on that. I think there was less than did in 2016, but I think that there were. And so I think it's like fair to just describe someone that way and call someone like, oh, you're just these adjectives? No, like everyone has way more nuance to them than that as an individual and as someone that God made, like no one should be just defined by those things. But
I've found that as a pastor, I usually encounter people who assume that I agree with them because we are of the same faith.
Sure.
That it usually doesn't cross their mind that someone who has the same faith as them might have a different political opinion as them. But as you said correctly, I believe those three pieces, conservative, Christian, and Republican, get put together like they're an inseparable package.
Sure.
And to a great degree, I feel like that's unhelpful.
I definitely agree with that. Yeah. It's because, assuming that taking faith and interpreting that in a practical way in the real world and the way it should be applied to government, assuming that there's only one way to do that is, I think that's wrong,
Yeah.
because I have plenty of friends that are Christians that would say, well, Jesus wanted us to give to the poor, therefore the government should be taxing us and taking that money and giving it to the poor. And I would wholeheartedly disagree with that. As a Christian, I believe that, God says that we have our own free will and we have kind of our own relationship with God that we need to follow that. And so the government shouldn't be telling me, hey, I'm going to take your money and give it to the poor. That it's way more godly of me to do that on my own free will. So those are both very different interpretations of the same scripture. And we're both Christians, and I'm not saying they're any less of a Christian, and they shouldn't be saying I'm any less of a Christian for believing those things.
Yeah. Well, what do you think the difference is now in terms of the political landscape for someone who's 20 years old in 3 days? Happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you.
You'll be 20 by the time that this comes out.
Yeah.
And so what do you think the difference is now than from somebody in my generation? What's the perceived difference as you look at your parents? I don't know how old your parents are. They're probably my age. What's the perceived difference in the political landscape, in your opinion, as a 20-year-old today?
From my perspective, when I'm looking out onto the political landscape, I think everyone sees this, but I see it as very divided. I see, people just kind of yelling at each other. Within my age group, I'm in college and I'm in an arts college. So I'm in a very specific bubble that tends to be very left. Now I have some friends that are in fraternities and they're in a bubble that's very right. So I still see some of that division. Political landscape wise, I see the general vibe that I get is like the predominance, I think, is pretty far left. And it's generally believed, at least on campus, that more liberal and democratic ideas are generally the moral right, which is understandable. If you look at those things from a certain perspective, I can see that conclusion. And then coming on the more right side of things, I get sort of, I tend to, people that are on the right side of the political spectrum, because libertarianism is sort of derived, a lot of the libertarianism is sort of derived from that. We talk a lot about politics in that way. And generally there's sort of a fear a little bit, I think, of speaking out our views on campus, especially. It's like, okay, there's sort of a predominance from the faculty and sort of a predominance from the rest of the student body that this is the accepted thing. And then kind of coming at it from a different perspective is, it's almost like an underdog type thing, and almost like a thing where it's like, I don't know if I want to necessarily bring that up in this discussion, but I don't want to blame people that believe that are on the left side of the political spectrum because of that. I'm sure if it was more popular to believe things that are more on the right side of the political spectrum, people on the left would feel the same way, where it's like, I think the problem is that there's this mentality of, am I going to get insulted? Am I going to get attacked personally if I say what I believe on either side? And that's bad.
Yeah.
We need to fix that. You don't want to, and I think some of that comes from a heart place as well, where you have to examine whether, if you're going to speak out your political belief, whether you're trying to put someone else down or whether you're trying to feel sort of a moral superiority because you believe is correct.
Sure. And we all think we're right.
Exactly. Yeah. I think one of my biggest flaws is, kind of coming, this is a thing I think with a lot of people that believe what I believe, where it's like, I've been blue pilled, like I know, I'm outside the left and the right, sort of thing. I have this alternative idea when, everyone believes they're right, and we need to listen to each other, and we need to not personally attack each other and attack each other's character when we're talking about these sort of things.
Okay. So let me follow up on that one immediately. How do you do that? I mean, it does feel like that there is a lack of opportunity to have. That's why I started this podcast, to be able to have conversations from different points of view. How do we help that? How do we move in the right direction?
I think for me, you have to get to know someone first. I'm just as guilty as anyone or as a lot of people of, going on Twitter, seeing someone say something and replying and saying something snarky and being like, send, ha, I own them, versus when I'm having a political discussion with a friend who disagrees with me, there's a totally different mindset because I know this person. I know this person at their heart is just like me, trying to get by, trying to live their life. They're not like, they don't believe something out of malicious intent. You know what I mean? No one does, or I'd like to believe that almost no one does.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking to someone about your political beliefs in that sense, where it's like a conversation face to face and you know that person, it's completely different. And so I know that it's unreasonable to expect, okay, only talk politics with people you know and are friends with. That's not reasonable. But maybe to come at it from that perspective of this person that I'm talking to, or even this person that I like want to reply, want to tweet at, they are as a person just as valuable as this person that, this friend that I had this political debate with earlier, where we were very respectful. And so, and that's something I'm not good at this. This is something I need to improve on.
Yeah.
But that sort of mindset thing where it's like, okay, this person is valued by God just as much as me, just as much as my friend.
Yeah.
That hopefully will put what you're about to say in perspective.
Isn't that interesting that you suggest that valuing the person above their perspective, their viewpoint, is a key to having meaningful discourse when you have different points of view. I'm not sure that there's been a whole lot of discussion about how to value someone, apart from a faith. I mean, maybe that's one of the issues. You certainly feel like that inclusivity wants to value people, but it's not quite sure why.
Yeah.
But you raise a great point there about value. I think about how oftentimes we tend to make a caricature of the people that we disagree with. So we just, make them look ridiculously simple. And almost no one is. I'm not going to say no one is, but almost no one is,
Yeah.
And so that relational piece that's tied to value, super interesting to me. Do you think, this is a question that's been kicked around a lot these days, do you think that politically our country is more divided than ever, or is it that we get to experience it in a completely different way these days?
Sure.
What's your thought?
I haven't been alive very long, so me saying that we're more divided than ever would be a little bit presumptuous, I think, personally. Now, do I think that that's possible?
Doesn't seem to stop many people from
sure.
saying that.
Do I think that that's possible? Yeah. If someone who had, if God came to Earth and said, yes, America is more divided now than it ever has been, I would be like, sure, that seems reasonable. Also, in that case, it would be God saying it, so it would be true. But I think it may be more likely that we are just as divided as we always have been, but things like social media and the internet are showing us that, and we may be even more divided now because those things are fueling that. Me from Nebraska never would have had the opportunity to get into a Twitter argument with someone from New York City, 50 years ago. That wouldn't have happened. And if that argument in the end reinforces our division, then, the internet existing would have then made us more divided. So I think using that logic, I definitely think that it's possible that we are more divided now, just because, social media promotes division in passive and maybe active ways. Things like Facebook algorithms and Twitter's algorithms promoting more controversial and inflammatory, language up to the top of your feed, things like that. Like that's because it gets them, more users interact at that point. So Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we were more divided, I guess is my answer.
Yeah, and who knows, right? And what's the scale that we're all going to agree on to use? I mean, the Civil
Sure.
War sort of comes to mind
Yeah,
as a
true.
fairly
I mean,
divided time, and
I was fairly worried that there was going to be another one of those, last summer. So
I know, right?
it's yeah.
It does feel like that. I don't know what it felt like at the time. Probably different because we didn't, as you said,
Sure.
share information immediately,
Yeah.
always. And I'm a big Hamilton fan, and
Yes.
I think, well, gosh, at least we're not shooting. That
Yeah.
Donald Trump and Joe Biden didn't do a duel,
True. Very true.
and shoot each other. But I do think that there's some pervasiveness to the dividedness of
Mhm.
of the country. So, what is the greatest? That's a terrible. I don't want to use a superlative. What is an exciting prospect for the political future because of people your age? And
Hmm.
what's a scary prospect of the political arena because of people your age?
That's a really interesting question. I would say I might start with, I'd say an exciting prospect is that I know a lot of people my age that care about politics.
Mm-hmm.
I know a surprising amount of people my age that care about politics, whether it's on one side or the other. And those people generally try to educate themselves. They try to know about the issues. They form their own opinion about it. In my opinion, some people do better than others at actually going and forming their own opinion, but at least they know about things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really cool. I can't speak for other generations, but I've heard other people talk about how their generations just kind of didn't necessarily care that much. They voted sometimes, but I know a lot of older people that would talk about how they would vote based on personality, or they would vote based on the perceived public's perception of that candidate rather than necessarily what they believed in.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really exciting. I think on the downside, and this is coming into my own political beliefs now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily think, there are a lot of people that have different opinions than me, and opinions that, in my opinion, if like put into practice in office, wouldn't necessarily go the best. That's my opinion. But I'm at least glad to see that for the most part, when it's people that I know and people that I'm personally friends with, we can disagree on things and still be friends afterwards. Doesn't always happen, but it happens most of the time. So I guess that's kind of a positive negative sandwich where it's like, here's a positive, here's a negative, here's a positive again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because when my perception of like the millennial generation, the generation kind of right before, I'm Gen Z. I'm very early Gen Z though. So I'm one of the oldest sort of parts of Gen Z. When I see millennials, I see a lot more division there than I think is in our generation. And that might just be because of what social media makes me see. But still, that's kind of my perception on it.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating. And it's a little bit disconcerting to me that I don't even make it into the next generation discussion from somebody in Gen Z. And so that's okay, though. It's very enlightening to think about how the baton gets passed in terms of political insight. It certainly was a weird thing I'm 54. It was weird to me that we had two 70 plus year old white men as the candidates. And I think that people who are in your generation, millennial and Gen Z, are noticing that and thinking, well, that's not a thing.
Yeah. that doesn't represent us.
That can't be the right way to go about this.
Sure.
Let me switch the angle to faith. How could faith be a positive influencer for change in the political landscape, and how could it be a negative one?
I think I'll do negative and then positive.
Okay.
Negative, I think, is using faith to justify things that don't necessarily, like, that shouldn't be justified by faith. I think that this is, once again, now we're getting more into my opinion.
That's fine.
Using because someone like, for example, like a George W. Bush, who his campaign, he kind of had this like compassionate Christian conservatism as sort of his like marketable traits.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of uses that, things like the Patriot Act that he passed while he was in office, where it's like, okay, now we're invading a lot of the privacy of Americans, or putting troops into the Middle East and staying there for a long time, when long past we would have needed to stay there.
Mm-hmm.
But using that under the justification of these people hate Christianity and we need to defend Christianity. That wasn't his entire justification, but that was part of it. And that was part of what made Christian conservatives vote for him. I think I don't think that anyone, I think that seems very, very presumptuous of him to claim that God would want him to do that. There were a lot of lives lost in those actions. There were a lot of people's privacy that were invaded by other people, by the government, because of those actions. And I think that that's like, I don't think that you can justify God wants me to do this, so I'm doing this. With that, that's a lot of actions taken under that presumption. Things like that, where it's like using faith to justify taking action, the government taking actions that you can't look in the scripture and be like, oh yeah, of course God would be down with this. Like, it's very like, ooh, that's very nuanced.
Yeah.
I think a positive though is, I mean, just going back to the kind of the foundation of America, which is a little bit cliche, but the idea that God created all human beings with inalienable rights that he gave us, and that the government should only exist to protect those rights. I think that that's extremely important. And, the idea that God, just gifted us with free will and gifted us with the ability to follow him or choose not to follow him, and to make our own out of our lives and try to follow his plan. I think that's, if the government uses that as its guiding sort of principle, which I think, in my opinion, is the Christian argument for libertarianism, where it's kind of the idea that God gave us free will and God gave us inalienable rights, and the government should exist to protect those things. I think that's beautiful. And that's a way of justifying faith into government and politics, but also not in a way that is like not in a way that's invading anyone else's rights, justifying that by faith. Does that make sense? I think that's what I was trying to say with the first. That's what I was trying to say with the first argument as well.
Let me ask you this follow-up question about faith then. Should we talk about politics more in church?
I don't know. That's tough, because I've been in a couple situations with that. I've been in a situation where the pastor starts talking politics and I start to cringe, because either I think that they're interpreting things from the Bible that they're relating to politics incorrectly, or they're projecting, I think, their own political opinion more into what they're saying about politics in the Bible than I think they should. I've also been in the opposite situation where I'm like, yes, speak that truth, where it's like that the pastor, I think, in my opinion, is either interpreting, how I interpret it, or is, I think the key is, it's so hard. I don't know. Because, I've, like I said, there's been times where I've been like, oh no. And there's been times where I've been like, yes, I feel like you're taking what God said and applying it to politics in a very accurate and kind of unbiased way.
Yeah.
It's so hard to, when you're talking about politics, it's so hard to discern what is your opinion and what you're taking directly from the Bible and is God's truth that he's saying in that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think on a case-by-case basis, it just should require a lot of prayer if you are going to bring up politics as a pastor in church. Asking God, okay, is this what I should be saying? Is this what you want me to say?
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. That's tough.
It is a tough one, and one that I wrestle with, and our leadership wrestles with. And one of the things that I love about our context is that we have a diverse leadership team.
Sure.
Which makes for interesting leadership meetings, because they don't always agree on everything.
Yeah.
And I think that makes us stronger, but we certainly are wrestling with the same questions.
Sure.
Last question from me, and then you're going to get a chance to ask me something.
Okay.
And so fast forward a generation or two. You're turning 40 years old.
Whoa.
Yeah. So there you go. Paint me a picture of a political arena landscape that would make you proud of your generation.
I think I would start with having multiple parties besides just the Republicans and the Democrats be able to have influence in politics. I'm registered as Libertarian. I voted for Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian Party candidate, this last election. I went to a couple rallies. I was pretty involved. So that's, but even like Green Party and other parties where it's like, we need to have more options that can reflect more accurately what people actually believe. I know so many people that are like, well, I don't really like this person, but I'm going to vote for them. Or this person doesn't really necessarily exemplify all my beliefs, but I'm going to vote for them.
Yeah.
Sure, why? Like the Republicans and the Democrats have those two parties have a foothold on American politics. And I think if 20 years from now we saw that there's several Libertarian senators and some Green Party senators and, local elections, there's so many other candidates that it's like, wow, there are 3 candidates here from 3 different parties or 4 candidates from 4 different parties that could take this election. I think that would be extremely, extremely good. I think personally, if we saw the government having a lot less power and having a lot less involvement in people's lives 20 years from now, I personally would be very happy. That would reflect a lot more of my beliefs. Yeah. But also, even more importantly, just discussion about politics not being so, everyone's just screaming at each other right now. No one is viewing each other as a human being. It's just this kind of wall that you're yelling at that has words painted on it that are words that you disagree with. And you're just screaming at it, telling it that it's wrong. And if we could just get away from that and treat each other like human beings and have dialogues that way, if that was common 20 years from now, I would be so happy. I think that might be the most important thing.
That would be great. What a cool picture of the ability to disagree and yet love people and value people. It's a great vision. All right. What do you want to ask me?
Wow. I don't know.
It doesn't have to be on this topic. Could be on anything you want.
Oh, okay. Well then I guess I would maybe ask what do you feel like the church should be doing differently regarding politics that, that could potentially help the situation that we're in right now?
Yeah. I'll answer it in a couple of different ways, Jacob. One is, I think that the church doesn't do a very good job of talking about church stuff with people who disagree.
Yeah.
So maybe we should start there, right? And learn how to have constructive, people honoring conversations about church stuff that we disagree with. Because if we can't get that right, how in the world are we going to take that and transpose it then out into a more open playing field?
Sure.
I read a lot just because it's fresh in my mind about Antioch this week and about how the church moved from Jerusalem to Antioch. And one of the things that I read was that Antioch was this super diverse metropolitan area and very, very different than Jerusalem, and had at least 18 distinct separate neighborhoods that were all culturally divided and everything like that. And that the Christ followers showed up and were first called Christians at Antioch because they didn't pay attention to any of their walls. And they had people coming from all these different, other divided places in order to be part of the gospel movement.
Yeah.
And so something about that captures my heart's imagination about the church. And boy, we can be so far from that as we're divided over not unimportant things, right? That's the
Sure.
key piece, is saying that's not unimportant. What you believe about baptism or what you believe about any number of different theological issues, they're
Yeah.
super important. But can we have a conversation about them within the church that values the person? And so going back to your thought about that. So I'd love that. And then I'd love, and I think that the church would be more impactful politically if we understood the third option that the gospel presents, right? So it's not conservative or liberal,
Yeah.
it's gospel,
Yeah.
which is neither of those. And if you got really good at the gospel part of it, I think you could make a bigger impact in the liberal conservative part of it.
Sure.
We got a long way to go, but I think having these kinds of conversations, hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully somebody shares this with a friend who they disagree with, and let's talk about that.
Yeah.
That's my hope anyway. So thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I look forward to having further conversations, and all the best to you.
For sure. Thank you. And to you too.
All right. Thanks, Jacob.
Thanks.
Now, if you thought this conversation was valuable, definitely subscribe, because there's more just like this one on the way. Around here, we think it's crucial to provide a safe and judgment-free place for people with different perspectives to come together and to learn from one another. Thanks for keeping it real with Reed. I'll see you soon.